Greetings and welcome to the channel. This is Michaela from Team Retrogue, where we like retro games and the devices that bring them to us. So back in October, I posted a first look video on the Ayn Odin 2. And in that video, I covered a lot of my first impressions of the device, as well as some of what it was capable of, such as emulation up to and including Nintendo Switch. And then, next thing I knew, 3 months had passed, other devices had come out, and I had never gotten back to actually finish my final review of the Odin 2. So it's time to go back, take a second look at this device, and give it some final thoughts. In the meantime, I'm also going to look at some other use cases for the Odin 2, such as Android gaming as well as streaming, and I'm going to take some viewer requests as well. My hope is, after watching this video, you'll come away with enough of an impression on the Odin 2 and the Odin 2 Pro that you'll be able to make a final informed decision, or you can decide whether or not you're happy with your existing purchase. So let's find out if the Odin 2 is worth your hard-earned dollar bucks. Let's dive in, and let's get to work. Now, before we get into the review, I do need to cover just a little bit of house cleaning. And the first thing I want to do is bring to your attention the fact that Team Retrogue now has a Patreon page. This is just an optional way to support the channel if you so choose. I only have a single tier of membership here, and if you decide that you want to support the channel financially, your name will be posted at the end of every video from the day you donate on. And my content will always be free. I never want to put anything behind a paywall, but I am working toward trying to get the channel financially independent from my personal finances, and so this is just one way in which I am trying to accomplish that goal. And so I don't want anybody to feel obligated to throw money at me, but if you want to, the option's there. Now, in my last video, the Odin 2 was still on early bird Indiegogo campaign pricing, but now the unit is actually available on their website in a variety of colors. Unfortunately, the base model is currently sold out, but I would actually recommend the Pro model over the base or the Max. I feel like that is the best price to performance ratio as far as your value for the money. I think the base is just a little bit too underpowered, and the Max is kind of overkill. So I would say go for that middle tier Pro model. And that's the model that we're going to be working with in this video today. And in my last video, despite it being a first look, I do a lot of comparisons to the original Odin Pro, as well as covering a lot of its capabilities, such as 3DS emulation at a 4x resolution, and I do also showcase some Nintendo Switch emulation. And so since this video is kind of a part 2 from that video, if you haven't watched it yet, I suggest you actually hit pause, go back, watch it, and then come back and continue this video. And I'll leave a link in the description to my first look video so that you can easily access it. Now, if you saw that last video, you probably saw that I went over the specs, but I do want to take a minute and just rehash the specs because I did make a small mistake in my last video, and I said that the Odin 2 had Wi-Fi 6. Now, I did receive a comment. It was kind of stern, but it basically told me to go back and double check the specs, which I did on Ayn's website, and the website says Wi-Fi 7. So I do want to take a second and make that quick clarification and apologize for any confusion I may have caused. But the specs that you see on screen are the correct specs. And it is important to know that the Odin 2 has Wi-Fi 7 built in, because that's going to come into play a little bit later in the video when I talk about streaming. Now let's take a quick minute to go over some of the changes since my last video, and one is with this app called Obtainium. And basically what this app lets you do is it allows you to download APKs and update them directly from GitHub repositories. And so I'm able to get the most updated build of Yuzu this way, but also I highly recommend you check out an app called Odin Tools, and you can use Obtainium to download this app. Now this adds a lot of extra functionality to your Odin 2. You can adjust the display saturation, you can change the controller style on the fly from the quick settings menu, including a disconnect option, which is absolutely necessary if you're going to be connecting an external controller for docked mode, because sometimes the built-in controller conflicts with the external controller and your external controller will be player 2. You can also change the L2 and R2 function, but I like to keep it at both by default. Now, in between videos, I like to actually browse the interwebs, and so I do end up on this little site called Reddit, and I just happened to notice a post there complaining that there was a lot of ghosting on the Odin 2 screen, and it's not something that I actually noticed personally. But apparently, the poster showed off the ghosting by swiping back and forth on the Android home screen, and I guess noticed some artifacting that was going on as the swipe was happening. Now, I'm including this footage so that way you can look and judge for yourself and see if ghosting is an issue on this handheld. I personally did not find that there was anything that bothered me, but I also don't use the actual Android front end. I use Daigisho because that's how I can access all of my retro games as well as my native Android apps. And that application or that home screen seems to move so quickly that it's hard to identify any type of ghosting, even if there is any. And so if that's something that your eyes are sensitive to, and if you were bothered at all by the footage that I just showed you, then at least you have that information to help make you an informed decision as to whether the Odin 2 is right for you. Now, I do want to talk about battery life and the sleep-wake mode. And the best way for me to talk about battery life is to talk about this game that I'm showing in the footage here. This is the Switch version of Nexomon Extinction running on the Yuzu emulator. And even though I have the Nexomon and Nexomon Extinction 2-pack for the Nintendo Switch, I've mostly been playing on the Odin 2. And while the game ran flawlessly at a 1x resolution in docked mode, I was more impressed by the fact that I could pick up this game, play it for a little bit, put the Odin 2 in sleep mode with the game still on, come back, it'll go right back into the game without even a hiccup, and I will not have lost that much battery in the process. In fact, I played this game for 2 hours before bed one night, put it into sleep mode, put it back on my end table, woke up, and the battery was only at 81%. Now, I know this is just an anecdotal retelling of what the battery life was like, but I had a full charge. I had just taken it off the charger before I started playing, which means that most of that battery drain was probably when I was actively playing the game, and then when I went into sleep mode, I barely lost any battery at all. So you're very easily going to get 6 hours of playtime on this device. It is surprisingly efficient. And they also put in a pretty beefy battery to boot. And I know that's not an extensive battery test, it's just a story. Unfortunately, I didn't necessarily have time to go through a litany of tests. I wanted to get this video out. But I can tell you, if you're worried about battery life, you're not going to be disappointed here because it is a good battery. Now let's get into our demonstrations of performance. And I'm going to start with how I personally have been using this device. And one of the games that I have been playing on the Odin 2 has been the Wii version of Punch-Out. This is by far my favorite version of the Punch-Out series, and it was also the last Punch-Out game to be released. And so I had to mess around with the controls a little bit to get the Dolphin emulator to emulate a sideways Wii remote, but then to be able to use the right thumbstick as a cursor, because in order to access the menu, you do need to emulate pointing a Wii remote at the TV to access a cursor. And that did take a little bit of tinkering. I had to switch to the OpenGL front end, and then I also had to set some hotkeys and all that in the Dolphin emulator. But the end result is I can play this game, and it's just as good as I remember. In fact, if Nintendo were to re-release this exact version of Punch-Out for the Switch, I would buy it. And so my good friend Dan, who just got an Odin 2 himself, turned me on to something called Ship of Harkanian. And basically, what this app does is it takes the original N64 ROM of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and it gives it a 4K upscaling, and it also uses the assets from the 3DS version of the game and puts it as a native Android app. And so I decided I was going to try this because his Odin 2 hadn't arrived yet, and I wanted to show him A, if it would work, and B, how good it looked. And I sent him a short 30-second clip of it running, and he was absolutely blown away. And then I showed this to a coworker of mine, and he was also absolutely blown away. So if you've never played Ocarina of Time before, and you have an Odin 2, or you're thinking about getting an Odin 2, this may quite frankly be one of the ideal ways to play the original Ocarina of Time. And so remember earlier in the video when I corrected myself and clarified that this device does come with Wi-Fi 7? Well, that means that it's going to handle local streaming very well. And so here I am playing Final Fantasy VII Remake, remote playing using the PS Play app, and this is footage coming from my PlayStation 5. Now, the only complaint that I have remote streaming a game like this is the 6-inch screen just feels a little bit too small. Maybe it's just because I'm spoiled, it might be a me problem, but I'm used to playing games like this on either my television or on my Steam Deck or on my PlayStation Portal, and those have 7-inch or higher screens. And so if I were to nitpick one thing about this unit, it would be that the screen is just a little bit too small for AAA games or for bigger titles. Obviously, you're not going to be able to play them natively, but you are going to struggle a little bit if you decide to remote play them just because the screen might not be as big as you would like. Now, to circumvent this, I actually am using a pair of AR glasses called the X-Real Airs, and I'm going to be doing a video on those in the future. But there have been a couple of times where I've taken this device because it's been lightweight, plugged them into the X-Real Airs, and just kind of sat on my couch and enjoyed the bigger screen and enjoyed the remote play experience. And so from that perspective, using this device as a streaming or remote play device might be better off if you have it docked to some type of external monitor. But if not, the 6-inch screen will still work. It's just a little small for my taste. Perhaps it's just the fact that the macular degeneration is setting in and I'm just talking like an old man. Now, a viewer requested that I actually take a look at the Google Play Pass subscription service to see if the Odin 2 is a worthwhile device to play Google Play Pass games on. And if you don't know what Google Play Pass is, it's basically a $5 a month or $30 a year subscription service that will give you access to a bunch of games on the Google Play Store for free with no in-app purchases. And so basically, if you have an Android device, this is a way to get a whole bunch of Android games for a small subscription fee without having to buy a bunch of apps. And so I went ahead and bought a month, and the first game that I downloaded was Monster Hunter Stories. This was one of my favorite 3DS games, and here I am playing the native Android port. Now, unfortunately, this does not have controller support, so I did have to utilize the Odin 2's key mapping software. But once I did that, I had a very enjoyable time replaying this game, and I may actually go through and beat this game again on this device just because of how well it works and how much more beautiful it looks compared to the 3DS version. Now, I also tried a game called Sortigo. This is a side-scrolling action-adventure platformer type game, and this is another game that doesn't have native controller support that I had to use the key mapper for. But once I did get the key mapping software toned into where I wanted it, I was able to play this game without using the touchscreen at all. And this also struck me as a pretty fun little side-scrolling game that I could just play in short bursts. And then the Play Pass games that had native support also seemed to work without a hitch. This is Turnip Boy Commits Tax Evasion, and I was actually pretty pleased to see that this game had made it to Android. And all of the native controls just work fine, and you could just boot up this game and start playing it. It's a relatively short game, but it is pretty funny. It has some cute little jokes in it, and it's actually got an enjoyable gameplay experience as well. And if you subscribe to Netflix, there are a small handful of games that you can actually download and play on the Odin 2, such as Ninja Turtle Shredder's Revenge. And there's a surprising amount of decent games if you are an active Netflix subscriber. You just have to sign in with your Netflix username and password, and you can play these games no problem. And I'm going to show off one last viewer request, and that is a standalone Android game called Alien Isolation. Now, this was a port of a console and PC game, and this game takes place 15 years after the events of the original Alien movie. And this type of game really isn't my style. I'm really not into the whole survival horror genre, and I was too scared to get into the actual parts of the game where you run into an alien. In fact, one of the first objectives in this game is to put my clothes on, and I struggled to figure out how to access the map to navigate to my locker to find my clothes to put them on. But I figured at the very least I could show some footage of the early game just to show that the game does run pretty well on the Odin 2. By the way, if you do get this game, press select to open the map. It'll make your life all that much easier. And just like most of the Android games that I tested, this has native controller support, so it will work with the Odin 2's controls right out of the box. Alright, it's time to wrap things up with my final thoughts on the Odin 2 Pro. And you could probably guess that the majority of the things I have to say are very positive. This is a nice, lightweight device with a killer battery that is extremely powerful and can do pretty much anything that you are going to throw at it. But it's not just emulation. This is also a great handheld for Android gaming due to its sheer power, but also due to the built-in key mapper for games that don't support controllers. And so if you have a Google Play Pass subscription, or you have one provided to you through your cell phone carrier, this could be a potentially great secondary handheld in order to play Android games on. Which really makes this the handheld to beat, because it is powerful, it is comfortable, it does have good battery life, and it has so many good things going for it that at time of recording, if you're really only interested in one handheld, it's really hard for me to recommend any other handheld but this one. Now, not every handheld is perfect, so let's now talk about some of the negatives. And one of the big things I have to say is that this screen was just a little bit too small for playing some of those AAA games. It can be used as a streaming device or an Xbox Game Pass device, but I would say this device shines more as an emulation or an indie game device. When it comes to playing some of the more AAA titles, you may just find that the screen is just a little bit lacking for those experiences. The price is kind of up there, starting at $300 for the base model, so the higher you get in models between the base and the max, the closer you're getting to Steam Deck pricing, and it may behoove you at that point to start looking at something like the Steam Deck, because then you can also play PC games. You are limited by the amount of emulators and how far those emulators have progressed. For example, the best way to play PS2 right now is on an emulator that is no longer being worked on, and the Yuzu emulator is still kind of in its infancy, so not every game is going to work as you would expect, and you are going to have to check compatibility lists to see if the game you want to play is emulatable in this device. And I do wish there was some kind of SIM card option, because I do like retro achievements. And so if there's a game that I'm playing that I want to earn retro achievements on, I have to make sure I only play it when connected to Wi-Fi. And in that case, I can't use this device. If I'm away, I have to actually make sure I'm connected to Wi-Fi, or I have to hotspot from my phone and use my phone's data instead. But overall, as far as recommendations go, if somebody were to ask me if they should buy an Odin 2, I would still tell them yes. Now, obviously, that recommendation would come with whatever their specific use case is. If they're mostly looking for emulation, I'm going to say, yeah, absolutely. If they're looking for PC games or local streaming, I may push them in a different direction. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Are you considering the Odin 2? Do you already have one and love it? Or do you already have one and hate it? Or is there anything you wish that the Odin 2 did differently? And feel free to continue the conversation in the Retro Handhelds and the Steam Machine Discord channels. It's where you could find me hanging out in between videos, and I would love to hear your input and have a conversation with you about it. And if you want to support me on Patreon, I'll leave a link in the video description as to where you can do that as well. And a big shout out and thank you to those who have already decided to support me on Patreon, even though the page has been live for not even 3 hours now. So thank you very much for your support and for helping to keep the lights on here at Team Retro. But that'll do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and if this has been helpful to you in any way, please be sure to like and subscribe. Until next time, bye for now, and don't stop believing.